Now, Pete, we're really excited because you're launching a new book here today.
Yeah.
And I think you've made a little film that you want us to see before we kind of talk about that book.
Yeah, this is so exciting because the book's not out yet. It comes out on the 20th of October in the UK. It's out in the States, but not here yet.
But we have copies here.
We've got, so like, this is literally, I've had people sending me messages on social media saying, I can't wait to get my copy of the book. And you guys don't have to. You can get it here. And maybe even if you sell them really quickly, you can sell them at a profit. I don't know. Not that any of you would do that, of course.
So you've just run out of stock, guys. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, the book is called Dirty Glory. It is the sequel to one that I wrote called Red Moon Rising. Red Moon Rising came out, where it was, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. It described the first 5 years of the 24/7 prayer movement. I didn't think anyone except my mum would ever read it. The reason I wrote the book was that my wife was desperately sick. I had been hijacked by a prayer movement, which is a peculiar thing to happen. We had no money, and a publisher said to me, we'll give you some money if you write the story down. I'm sorry, if you want a more spiritual answer, but that was part of the motive there. And I just didn't want to starve. You know, I hope you don't judge me for that. And I wrote it, and then it's gone all over the world. It's in so many different languages, I've lost count. My mum was in a village church in Slovakia and found a copy in Slovakian. So eventually I thought I ought to get down and write sort of the follow-up, and this describes the next 10 years of the movement, and it's about prayer, mission, and justice.
Should we roll the video?
Yeah, this is the video. I've come here only twice. The first time I was hitching around Europe, camping on these cliff tops, cooking fish on open fires, and by day I would plunge into the ocean, relentlessly hitching west until I could go no further, until I reached this place where the sun sinks into the sea. The Romans thought it was the end of the world. My second visit, years later, was a sort of pilgrimage to the place of my call. I stood again on these cliffs, staring out at this same sea, trying to pray, trying to process the wonder and the terror of the years since my previous visit. A global movement had been born. Somehow a vision had come to pass, but the years had been harder than anyone knew. My wife had nearly died too many times. We were broke, dead beat, deep bone, exhausted. I've been here only twice. The Romans thought it was the end of the world, but for me it has become the beginning of another, my Bethel, my place of prayer, my field of dreams. On these cliffs, that first time I saw something, a vision, a premonition, rising from the pages of an atlas. That night I saw an army. And on my second visit, as I stood here staring west, wondering why, wondering what it all meant, the first plane hit the first tower in New York City. And the world is shaking still. This then was to be our story. This was to be our time.
Beautiful. I think that deserves a round of applause.
So exciting. You're the first people we've sort of publicly showed it to, so thank you.
It's very exciting. It's a beautiful film. You've got to tell us where the title came from. What does Dirty Glory mean?
The book's called Dirty Glory, first of all, because I like Johnny Cash, and it sounds like a Johnny Cash song. Secondly, it's really a book about the paradox of grace. It's about the fact that it seems to me that God's story from beginning to end is about his glory getting dirty and dirty, messed up people like us carrying his glory. And so the book's full of stories about really carrying the good news of Jesus into very dark places and the incredible things that we've seen in Mexican walled cities of prostitution and in Ibiza, which the Daily Mail calls Sodom and Gomorrah, where we run an ambulance service. And there's surprising and hopefully quite funny stories throughout it. But my conviction is that God's glory belongs amongst us in the dirt. It starts, you imagine, the Bible starts with God breathing his spirit into a fistful of dust. And then the New Testament begins with the glory of God incontinent, inarticulate, lying in a manger. And then he grows up and he recruits messed up people and says, now go and carry my glory to the ends of the earth. So that, to me, that's the paradox. It's good news for us because I don't know about you, but I often don't feel worthy or, that God can ever use me.
And I've read the book, and it is beautiful, and the poetry that you hear just in that video clip kind of continues all the way through. And I hadn't been aware that 9/11 had such an influence on the movement. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that kind of began the whole movement?
Yeah, it was a strange thing that Cape St. Vincent really is this very extraordinary place for me. It's the most southwesterly point in Europe. And the first time I was there, it was not a sort of Christian thing. I was just a long-haired hippie student hitchhiking around Europe and having the time of my life. And then camped there that night. It was very strange. I received a vision. I heard this buzzing noise. I began to shake, and which is a bad thing to do on a cliff top. and I saw an army of young people just rising up out of the pages of an atlas. I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't tell anyone for a long time because I thought they'd think I was nuts. And then it began to happen when we started a prayer room in Chichester in a warehouse, and it went viral and began to spread. And suddenly we found that, well, we're now in over half the nations on earth with the 24/7 prayer movement. We've been praying non-stop for 17 years. And so then fast forward a little bit, I intimated in the video, but what happened was that for a while we thought, this is it. We've found the great revival switch. It's prayer, and everyone was wanting to do it. Prayer rooms were springing up everywhere from the US Naval Academy to the slums of Delhi. And then my wife got very, very sick and very nearly died many times. And to this day still has a chronic illness. And I found that the prayers I thought could save the world, I wasn't even sure if they could save my wife. And so I had to begin to work out, how do you live with the paradox of the things God has done, but also the things he hasn't done yet? How do I live with integrity and honesty about my pain, but also with the integrity and honesty of the good things God's done? So that was the space, and out of that I wrote a book called God on Mute. And then when we were in Southampton General Hospital on one of the first visits, and wondering whether Sammy would ever survive, I sort of did God a deal. I said, if we ever get out of here, I'm going to take her to that place where I had that weird vision thing. I need to try and make sense of this weird thing that I do with my life, facilitating prayer, mission, and justice all around the world, whilst trying to care for my kids and freaking out about my wife's health. And so we stood there on those cliffs that you just saw. And I don't know if you've ever been back to a place that is holy or significant for you. It rarely works. you want it to be this big, meaningful thing, and often it's just not. And so I stood there trying to make it meaningful. I remember I bought a grey a metal cross pendant from a sort of market stall, and it's so cheap it leaves grey marks on my skin to this day. And I was just, we tried to pray, and we're saying, God, what is this? What are you doing? And it was as we left Cape St. Vincent, we were driving in an open-top Jeep. We put on the radio, and there was some Portuguese music playing. Sammy had a big hat on her head because she had a big scar on her skull to protect her from the sun. And we suddenly began to hear this frenetic speech and realized that just under the Portuguese translation, we were hearing the voice of the President of America. And it was very hard to hear because it was being translated. And we began to realize, and literally as we stood there on those cliffs, saying, God, why are you raising up prayer all around the world? What's this for? What's this about? What's the urgency? At that moment, the Twin Towers were coming down. And I felt that, I hope I'm not self-referenced enough to think that me being at Cape St. Vincent had anything at all to do with that. But I do think there's a symmetry to life when you try and walk in step with God. And something within that sort of divine choreography put us there at that moment. And I do believe that that is the event that has shaped our world to this day. And it is one of the great reasons that we need to preach peace. We need to pray for peace. We need to make war in the heavenly realms that we might bring peace and reconciliation on earth and so on. So yeah, that place is significant. That event is significant for everyone, and certainly for the 24/7 movement.
One of the things I love about the 24/7 movement is that you are combining prayer and justice. And a lot of people don't see a connection. For some justice activists, prayer is a bit of a waste of time. It's very easy, sit in a room and pray while the world's dying. And, for some prayer activists, actually, justice is irrelevant. It's all about me and God. I can close my eyes and shut out the world. Why is it important for you to keep these two things together? And what does that look like for 24/7?
Well, at every level, prayer and social engagement belong together because, first of all, Jesus set us no other precedent. He was profoundly prayerful, often staying up all night praying, and walked and talked with the Father in ways that no one else has ever done. And yet, when he came to state his mission, it's Isaiah 61, it's good news to the poor. Isaiah 58 says that there's some relationship between how we treat the poor and whether our prayers get answered. And I could go on. So there's a deep integration. I believe what we need is a deeper ecology that understands there is a spiritual dimension in life, and that is integrated with the material realm. And therefore, those who just want to live in some spiritual plane, praying and never engaging with the poor, are missing the deep ecology of life. But equally, those who are just frantically trying to sort of fight injustice without the ultimate righteousness of walking in relationship with God prayerfully in every other way are missing the deep ecology. And I suppose I could sum it up by thinking about Mother Teresa. I find it so interesting that her organization, their mission statement is to satiate the thirst of Christ on the cross. It says nothing about injustice. It's all about sort of worship. And I find that profoundly interesting because if you think that what her order does is they rescue people who are dying and are forgotten and insignificant, and they care for them until most of them do eventually die. That's what, as you know, they do. Now, look, if you're thinking strategically rather than prayerfully, it's the least strategic thing you could possibly do with your time because they all die and they are people that no one's ever heard of. And so you might, with good intentions, do that for a year or 5 years, but eventually you'd go, what we've got to do is lobby government for a change of conditions, or we've got to educate. You'd start to say, how can we be more strategic? How can we stop this happening in the first place? The reason that Mother Teresa's order keeps doing this day in, day out is that it's worship. They are finding Christ in the poor and the broken, and it is an act of devotion to him, and no one in the world may notice, but they know he smiles. And he says in Matthew 25, in so much as you've done it to the least of these, you have done it to me. So there is something about being rooted in the heart and the purposes of God that enables us to live meaningfully and sustainably in a way that engages with the oppression and the injustice of our world without losing hope.
Oh, you're going to have a chance to chat to Pete yourself in a minute when he's signing some books. So let me ask you one last question. You referenced already quite a few times, Sammy, your wife's life-threatening illness. And I remember myself, but also loads of my friends being really helped by God on Mute. How do you find prayer or the voice of what to say to God when God doesn't seem to be answering at all? Maybe there are people here or watching that are in that place where they've run out of words to say to God. God hasn't done what they thought he would do. How can you help someone to find a voice to speak to God again?
The first thing to say is that we mustn't misunderstand God's silence for his absence, because he says, I'll never leave you, I'll never forsake you. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for God is with me in that place. We always want God to airlift us out of our problems, but more often, in my experience, he parachutes in and joins us in the midst of them. And that is our experience. For us, the valley of the shadow of death has often looked like the MRI scanner. And when Sammy goes into those, you can't even wear your wedding ring in there. You are really alone, and she'll be in there for at least half an hour, and it's noisy. And I know some people just go in because they've got some tissue issues they would need to look. But for her, sometimes it's really going to tell her what her future is. And she learned very quickly that by memorizing Psalm 91 and repeating it in her head, she could be pulled out of this tube and say, God was with me in there. No one else could be, but God was. This is the hope we have in Christ. And I'll just say one more tiny thing, and it's this. One time, because I've never been very good at Christianity. And so for a while I gave up and became an atheist. And then I made this depressing discovery that I was even worse at atheism. I was just a dreadful atheist. I kept talking to God about the fact he didn't exist. And I was hopeless at it. I'm so bad at everything. So one time when I'd been praying and crying out to God, asking him to stop a particular epileptic fit that Sammy was having, and once again it hadn't worked. And I'd even tried quoting Bible verses at God. Have you ever noticed it doesn't really impress him very much? And then she woke up in hospital once again. And I remember driving in the next morning thinking, what am I going to say to her? And I remember saying to her, I'm not proud of this, but I said to her, darling, maybe just God isn't real. I mean, if anyone tries to tell me there's any great cosmic purpose to you having another fit, I mean, it's just rubbish. Surely, why don't the things Jesus promised happen? Am I being too honest for you? You know the Bible is more honest than the church. About half of the Psalms are lament. They're not happy clappy. You know the word Israel means the struggle. You got baptized into the struggle. Not easy answers, but a bunch of questions. So, and by the way, asking these questions is an act of faith. If you're an atheist, you don't struggle with unanswered prayer. You just go, of course it doesn't work. But if you're struggling with unanswered prayer, then that's an act of faith. Anyway, I digress. So I said to her, maybe it's not true. And this is what she said to me. She said, Pete, getting rid of God right now won't help. Getting rid of God right now means philosophically that I'm just a highly evolved animal on a rock in space. And if Darwin is right, and it's the survival of the fittest, I'm definitely not fit, and I should be wiped out of the gene pool. There's not a lot of hope for me right now in that worldview that you're advocating. She said, no matter how hard it is to understand why God in his love allows us to go through these things, as long as we can cling on to him, we still have hope. Yes, hope for healing. Yes, hope for life after death. but also hope of experiencing his presence here in this moment. A hope rooted in the cross of Christ, a God who suffered with us and for us. No other religious outlook has this hope, the glory of a cross. And so, she didn't put it quite like that. You understand, she was in hospital just coming around from a seizure. Give her a break, you know. And I think, and there's so much else I could say, but when you're going through those hard times, find God in the problem, not just in the prospect of being released from the problem. Understand that he loves you and that he is your greatest hope. And learn to lament, learn to struggle with God, and maybe step into a faith that is less hermetically sealed and formulaically provable, and is far more like any real relationship, messy and confusing, at times painful, but ultimately profoundly true.